If you want to understand why Trump just called Ukraine's president a dictator, it's helpful to first understand the platform on which he did it. Truth Social is immensely important to Donald Trump. It is his direct conduit to his followers, where he often creates a kind of repetition-driven reality.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. They should be a state.
In the minds of Justin Trudeau and his cabinet, they no longer believe that this annexation stuff is a joke.
He uses his social media platform to publicize his plans, his executive orders on a whole range of issues before he's even signed them into law.
China's involved with the Panama Canal. They won't be for long.
And it's often where we get the clearest sense of who Trump perceives as a friend and who he perceives as an enemy. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, he now describes as a dictator without elections, ignoring, perhaps, that his country is being invaded by someone who's ruled Russia for the last 25 years. So where does this claim come from? And does Trump really believe that Ukraine brought this war on itself? So Trump's claim that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is a dictator seems to spring pretty clearly from this. He refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls. Let's tackle those one at a time. It is correct that Ukraine hasn't had an election since Zelenskyy first came to power in a landslide about 6 years ago. His term should have only lasted 5 years, meaning it should have expired last year, except Ukraine is under martial law because it is actively at war, under attack. Russia has, over the course of 3 years, been pushing its military forces towards the Ukrainian capital. To date, it has managed to capture about 1/5 of the entire country.
Millions of Ukrainians had to flee when the full-scale invasion started. You also have to keep in mind that you have millions of people who are internally displaced. You have hundreds of thousands of people who joined the army who are currently on the front line. There's also the question of the millions of people, of Ukrainians who are currently living under occupation, who are citizens of Ukraine, who wouldn't have the possibility to vote if elections were being organized.
It's also worth mentioning the country's own constitution states pretty clearly that if a parliamentary term is up and martial law is still in place, its powers are extended until basically after the cancellation of the state of martial law, which is all just a fancy way of saying there's an order to things. You can't hold an election while the country is at war under martial law, and we've seen versions of this before. During the Second World War, the UK went through a period where it didn't hold an election for 10 years. It had one in 1935, and it should have had one in 1940, but because of the war, it was postponed each year for 1 year at a time, all the way until 1945, near the end of the war.
The people of Britain decided on the kind of government they want. It was the first general election for 10 years.
Now, I don't know if history or even Trump looks back on Winston Churchill as having been a dictator, because the decision to postpone elections was agreed upon by a majority of parliament. The same is true in Ukraine, where even opposition parties have stated the only winner of an election in wartime Ukraine would be Putin, who they believe would try to influence the outcome.
We're hearing that Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, or essentially martial law in Ukraine. And yeah, I would say that, you know, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people have to, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
Trump has now repeated one of Putin's key demands, that even in the middle of a war in which towns are under siege, soldiers and civilians are dying, that Ukraine should shake up its government. And Trump's supporting argument that the people of Ukraine want an election?
The leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens.
This premise is false. The latest numbers I've seen from a major Ukrainian pollster show Zelenskyy with a 57% trust rating, down significantly since the start of the war, but nowhere near 4%.
In fact, his popularity increased over the last few weeks, especially after those claims by Donald Trump.
Just for reference, that is higher than where most polls put Trump's favorability ratings, which suggest more people in the US than not view him unfavorably. So it's not at all clear to me where Trump is pulling this 4% number from. And I've tried looking. I can't make heads or tails of it. And as is almost always the case, Trump hasn't provided any evidence at all that he hasn't just made this number up. Another statement Trump has made, and has yet to walk back if he misspoke, was to suggest Ukraine was in fact the aggressor. And maybe that's why the US has so far largely shut it out of talks with Russia.
But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
It should go without saying, in the strictest, most literal sense, Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. This isn't even open for debate, so let's move past it. Because maybe what Trump is getting at is to argue that Ukraine provoked Russia into attacking it.
In order to wage his war of aggression against Ukraine, Vladimir Putin had to find a reason. And for him, the reason is a threat, the imagined threat represented by NATO.
Listen to how Trump thinks of Russia's decision to invade. And I'll play a big chunk of it, unedited, so that you can understand his train of thought.
Russia's taken over a pretty big chunk of territory. And they also have said from day one, long before President Putin, they've said they cannot have Ukraine be in NATO. They said that very strongly. I actually think that that was the thing that caused the start of the war. And Biden said it, and Zelenskyy said it, and I think that was one of the reasons, one of the starts of the war. But from long before Putin, they said you cannot have Ukraine going in any way into NATO. And I start from that standpoint.
The case he seems to be making is that Russia had a red line. Ukraine can't join NATO, but it's trying to. It's been trying for decades. And by Trump's thinking, this effort gave Russia a reason to invade Ukraine. And importantly, just to repeat,
they said you cannot have Ukraine going in any way into NATO. And I start from that standpoint.
When Trump says, I start from that standpoint, he's talking about a concession he made to Putin, even before negotiations began, that any talk of Ukraine joining NATO is a non-starter. What's less clear is whether this extends to believing Russia was justified in attacking Ukraine, that its invasion was, in fact, simply a defense of Russia. That's what Vladimir Putin has claimed since the start, and you would have to believe it to believe Ukraine instigated this war, which began with Russian boots marching onto Ukrainian soil.
There is one aggressor, and that is Moscow waging a war against Ukraine.
Trump's most recent comments, filled with epithets, insults, and innuendo, show very plainly Zelenskyy is no friend. And Zelenskyy doesn't seem to think highly of Trump either, by the way. He's now openly accused him of living in a disinformation bubble, and he effectively warned the world at an international forum how close Trump was to being manipulated as a pawn in Putin's grand plan.
Putin will try to get the US president standing on Red Square on May 9th this year, not as a respected leader, but as a prop in his own performance.
So here we have the unraveling of a relationship between two countries, forged in blood and bullets, now reduced to social media posts, calling a world leader under siege a modestly successful comedian turned dictator, ripping off Americans, and all in all, doing a terrible job.